Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our June webinar in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub Expanded Horizons series. This is brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wagaya people, who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which each of you are joining us. I pay respects to elders both past and present and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who may be present today. My name is Prue Cook. I'm from Nine Creeks Consulting and I'm your webinar host across the series. This webinar series is for those of us who work with farming and regional communities from policy through to the paddock, and it challenges us to think differently regarding how we approach engagement, extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. Through this series, we explore novel thinking and new ideas from different sectors, industries and countries to stimulate new approaches to collaboration and building rural resilience. Our guest today is Michael Thomson, who is the Deputy Director from the Institute of Future Farming Systems at CQU. And Michael and I are going to discuss his team's work in developing extension programs for 6 different emerging industries. We're going to weave through how he applies behavioural science principles in extension, plus discuss his current PhD on the use of creative nonfiction storytelling in agriculture. So a really cool mixed bag of extension topics for you today, but all wrapped up in the package of emerging industries. Now, if you've participated in one of our webinars before, we're not about death by PowerPoint. Michael and I are going to have a conversation about his work. So if you're driving or you're listening to the recording, you can kind of do it while you're doing other stuff. We invite you to ask questions and share your own experiences at any time during the chat. And you're also going to be sent a recording of this webinar after it finishes. So don't worry if you need to leave early or if you have any technical difficulties. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Prue. Thank you for having me. I must say how excited I am to be on here and how much I've enjoyed the webinar series so far.
Thank you, thank you. Now, Michael, we met many, many years ago, back when you were working in corporate communications, and you're now the Deputy Director of the Institute for Future Farming Systems at Central Queensland University. Tell us a little bit about you and the work that you do.
Okay, so yes, we met years ago when I was working for a consultancy, and before that I was an agricultural journalist, so always been in that media, PR sort of space in agriculture, and came to work here at CQU. I guess a bit of an experiment to be in the role I'm in. Came here in 2016. Unusual in a university to have a comms person embedded within a research team. So I'm embedded within the ag researchers, work with them day to day. You know, part of that conversation when they're designing projects and helping get the message out there about what they're doing in practical sense. So I guess the idea being that if you've got comms and extension as part of the conversation from the get-go, it's going to help with comms and extension all the way through to the end of that project. And so it's challenged some of the researchers, having someone saying, let's put that in layman's speak, what does that mean to the punters, but it's all about raising awareness of what they're doing, building relationships, trying to acknowledge that scientists can't be everything to everyone. Let them do what they do well, and let's value add that by having someone with specialist skills in the research team as well.
Perfect, perfect. Normally we start these webinars with a bit of a 101 and we go over some basic terminology and concepts, particularly recognising that we often have some new practitioners in our audience. But today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to start by discussing emerging industries, and then we're going to go into the application of behavioural science principles to emerging industries. And then we're going to finish with some creative fiction non-storytelling as it relates to your PhD. So we're going to tick off on any new terminology as we go. So at a high level, I would like you to tell us about the current AgriFutures extension program that you're working on. And while you do that, I'm just going to quickly share a poll for our audience members to see whether they're working in emerging industries or thinking about it, or where they're sitting.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, here at CQU we do comms and extension for a number of research projects. Some of them very mainstream with MLA, and in the livestock space, obviously being in the beef capital, that's a big thing. But we also have in the north, there's a lot of opportunities to do a lot of different things, and so we're also supporting AgriFutures Australia and delivering a project for them for their emerging industries program, and that's a national program, not just in the north, and it's focused on, I guess, raising awareness of promoting the value propositions associated with and trying to encourage participation in 6 emerging industries, and they're sesame, hazelnuts, insects, industrial hemp, seaweed, and native foods. I'm pretty sure I got them all. And AgriFutures has taken a really strategic approach to this in saying, rather than, lots and lots of small projects and, these are small emerging industries, let's see if we can scale these ones up that have got a really bright future and take a much more longer term strategic approach to their extension and adoption programs. So, and a big part of being emerging industries is that not a lot of people know about them. So a lot of those activities that we've done in the first year of the project has been in that fundamental space around awareness and community. How do we talk about ourselves? How do we frame the conversation? So that's where we're up to at the moment in supporting those 6 very diverse and different industries.
Perfect. And so you said a lot of people don't know about these 6 industries, and I'm going to put my hand up and say that I'm probably one of them. So can you give us a quick little skim over the top of each of the 6 of them in terms of, any geography, particularly any notes about the type of producers that are involved and other key industry stakeholders for each of those 6? Shall we start with hazelnuts?
Yeah, sure. So hazelnuts have been around for a long time, but they're a bit of a traditionally small acreages, family farmers, a lot of I don't want to sort of generalize too much in saying that retirees, buying a block, planting hazelnuts, creating an orchard as an longer term investment activity. But it's a very diverse sector in that, well, that's the bulk of producers. At the other extreme is the arrival of Ferrero Rocher and their Agri Australis initiative, which is hundreds of thousands of trees in one orchard in the Riverina, which is not a non-traditional production area, but they've got access to water, slightly warmer than traditional growing areas. So there's some really interesting research going on around varieties, adaptation, performance, and spreading the geographic footprint of that industry.
Yeah, excellent. Ferrero Rocher is definitely an industry that I'm pretty sure I'm supporting.
You support it.
Yep, absolutely. Let's go to industrial hemp next.
Yeah, so a crop that you can grow in every state of Australia. There's varieties suited to all the climates. So from Tassie all the way to Kununurra. AgriFutures, I guess its flagship project in that space is the industrial hemp variety trials. So varietal trials in every state. As a way of evaluating agronomy and variety for those specific climates. An amazing crop, an amazing story behind the crop, and the fact that it sort of was so common 100 years ago on every farm, almost every farm, to then disappearing entirely, to now this reawakening of you can make almost anything out of hemp. The driver from AgriFutures is that it's as a food crop for human consumption. So very healthy seed, non-toxic, non-hallucinogenic, industrial hemp, so very, very low THC. So there's, there is an established market for hemp seed, and we need to find the varieties that will maximise production of those in each of the regions. So again, a very fast-growing industry, very diverse base. We've got broadacre farmers, established traditional farmers growing under pivot, through to lots of people who are just, interested in alternative ways of farming.
Perfect. Insects.
Yeah, who would have thought? It is a bit of a cognitive sort of blocker for a lot of people, the idea of eating insects, but anyone who's spent a bit of time in the developing world would know that it's pretty common to, eat crickets or eat insect food products, and I've done it in Mexico, loved it, it was really yummy. So yeah, there's a huge opportunity there from the point of view that insects are really efficient converters of food waste. So, and they have a low, very small geographic footprint, so you can produce a lot of insects very quickly and efficiently in a small space. Insect product, I guess end product, such as black soldier fly larvae, can go into stock feed as well as, for example, so there is an insect-based dog food available already that has been supported by AgriFutures called Buggy Bix. And black soldier fly larvae are, very high in energy, protein, good oils, good fats. So, they're a great nutritional source. We just got to get over ourselves a little bit in terms of being willing to add it to our diet as well.
Yeah, I was going to say I might stick with the Ferrero Rocher, but is what and how are they produced? Is this sort of predominantly an urban, like a factory setting, or what does the production look like?
Yeah, so it's there's I guess again a range of things. So we know of factory small factory sort of setups in say Western Sydney or Melbourne. We also know of people out in rural areas like Dubbo. Because they can be set up in a small way, and wherever you've got a food source, food waste that can be converted, it's suitable to be done in any location, really.
Excellent. Seaweed.
Yeah, seaweed's really cool. I mean, we sort of take it for granted that seaweed, when we think about seaweed as an agricultural product, we sort of forget that we eat it a lot already. Wrapping around our sushi, so it's got a place in our culinary sort of spectrum already, but seaweed offers a whole heap of other opportunities as well. So a lot of people might have heard about asparaginopsis as a source of livestock feed because of its anti-methodogenic compound. So adding a small amount of asparaginopsis to the diet of cattle has a dramatic, like over 90% reduction in the amount of methane that animal emits. So there's a huge opportunity there, and how do you convert that into an economic prospect when there's so many cattle in Australia, but we also have a lot of sea. You can farm seaweed ocean-based or on land in sort of aquaculture tanks. So there's literally thousands of species of seaweed. So we're really only at the tip of the iceberg of what different species can do. So, kelp versus asparaginopsis versus others, environmental services, cleaning the water, carbon sinks, through to human consumption. There's a real range of opportunity there.
Perfect. And producers of seaweed, I'm imagining that this is predominantly more a corporation or like a large scale organizational based thing?
Again, it depends on the type of seaweed. There are beachcombers, and this is while that might sound a very unprofessional way of by modern agricultural standards, this is something that's been normal in cultures around the world for thousands of years. Beachcombing, collecting seaweed, washing, putting it into the diet for either human or other or stock purposes. So we've got beachcombers through to big corporates who are setting up big seaweed farms, or have set up some already. There's a couple in New South Wales on the coast. And the thing about seaweed is it brings there's a lot of job opportunity that goes with it in regional areas as well, in those coastal communities, as opposed to when we talk about ag extension, often our mindset jumps inland. So it's a different sort of scope there, but it's still an agricultural opportunity.
Oh, I'm learning so much. Native foods is the next one. Now that's a pretty broad scope. Are there particular native foods that the team is working with here, or?
Yeah, look, it is a massively broad scope. There's again thousands of food sources in the Australian ecosystem that have been relied upon for thousands and thousands of years for First Nations people, and we only know the tip of the iceberg with them. But I guess what AgriFutures is trying to do is support Indigenous communities as well as entrepreneurs from other sectors to bring those to a commercial scale. So it's an economic enabler for First Nations communities, but and I guess what we're looking for, or what AgriFutures are looking for, is what's the next barramundi, what's the next macadamia nut that the world loves, and there's so many things out there that a bunch of food types I'd never even heard of. Marron in WA as a crustacean, kakadu plum. There's a big range of native grains, harvesting wild grasses and turning that into flour for breads with a really unique flavour. So there's a combination of people participating in that. We've got tech entrepreneurs, doing aquatic marine production in really high-tech situations, through to Indigenous-led development in their community, trying to revive traditional practices in a commercial way for their economic future. So it's a really interesting space.
Perfect. And the last of the 6 is sesame.
Yeah, sesame's, well, we all know, we've all tasted sesame, that sesame seed bun at that particular fast food outlet. So there's white sesame, which is we're all familiar with, and then there's also black sesame varieties, both super nutritious. Sesame oil, you can make ice cream out of it, you can make all sorts. As you think about open sesame and Alibaba, and where sesame comes from, traditionally is hot, arid climates. So when you think about Australia, we've got a fair chunk of land that's like that. A lot of environments like that. So AgriFutures has funded a 5-year national program of research in sesame for both white and black. What gets farmers' attention is the fact that things like black sesame, $2,000 a tonne. That makes everyone sort of stand up and pay attention. And I guess what we're looking at is, where does sesame fit within that broader farming system? It's a new crop, it's a high value crop. It's probably not going to be replace really the big established things like wheat or cotton, but where does it fit in the system as a high value break or rotational crop? Because we know it can put up with the heat and moisture stress. We've done trials all across Northern Australia through the CRC for Northern Australia, which is also co-funding research in this space. So yeah, very exciting time for broadacre farmers looking for a new high value crop to add to their mix.
Okay, perfect. So from the 6 that you've described, then we've got sesame and hemp, 2 that might potentially be targeting existing producers to add something to diversify their system, but the rest of them are sort of looking at either new producers who may not have had exposure to agriculture previously, or sort of larger corporates. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, it's very hard in the emerging space to cast very solid generalizations, but yeah, I guess this is the challenge of the project, is that you're dealing with a really broad spectrum of audience, and that of course makes comms challenging, because you can't stereotype and say, I know this message will work with, because we're talking to a really wide range of demographics within each industry.
So how have you gone about developing your extension program for each of these? Where did you start, and what information have you needed to collect?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because it is tricky, and I think the first and foremost thing that every extension practitioner needs to do is do a lot of listening. We're dealing with emerging industries. They're not big corporates. They don't have market research budgets. They don't have established large customer bases to lean on, or consumer networks. So what we've got to do is do a lot of listening to the people who are at that coalface, try and gain from them the insights about what has worked, why they got excited about participating in an industry, what their neighbours think. You do a lot of information gathering, and that's an iterative process. Like, that never stops, because that's going to evolve over time. So you've got to keep listening. So the other part of it is, when you've got a emerging industry, because they haven't had that solid foundation or big foundation, there's a fair bit of foundational work to be done in the comm space. So the first question we often ask is, how do we talk about ourselves? If we don't know we're going to describe ourselves, how do we expect other people to describe us properly? So we go through a process of that key message development, so that we can frame conversations effectively when we're out in the field and trying to recruit new producers. So combining that listening of what are those push button things that got the existing players excited. Let's try and develop messages around that to frame a conversation to get more people in, to create curiosity. So that's the really first and foremost thing you've got to do. Listen and work out how you're going to talk about yourself before you can convince anyone else that you're worth listening to.
Yeah. So Are you finding that then this is a similar approach that's applicable across all of the six industries, or is it kind of highly industry specific or place based in terms of what the extension is going to look like going forward?
Yeah, so that step is very consistent.
Yep.
Then when you talk about applying that in a practical sense with, what are the activities you're going to do around that, that really varies quite a bit because of, you're doing some very coarse sort of audience segmentation. Okay, well, we know this group is looking for long-term investments for, life after work, retirement income streams or whatever, versus, big corporates who are very motivated by dollars and ROI, others who are just, who are just really passionate about finding environmentally sustainable farming and getting into a different aspect of agriculture. So they're motivated by different things, and so you've got to think about your tactics then. What are the buttons that you're going to push and how you're going to push them? So do we need to get face to face? Do they need to hear stories? Do they need to see dollars and cents? You start to break it down a little bit sector by sector then.
Perfect. Now, one of the things that I was really keen to explore in inviting you on Expanded Horizons, Michael, was, when you've got a new industry and you don't have all these preconceived ideas about this is how we do extension, is there anything that we would currently do in other sectors that we just are like, well, this is what is extension? Is there anything that sort of falls by the wayside in terms of, oh no, that's not really an approach or a format that passes muster for an emerging industry? Have you come across anything in that sense?
Yeah, again, that horses for courses thing, you'd be surprised how much people still carry into those new industries a preconceived idea about what extension is around fact sheets and field days. They sort of, how we get, well, let's have a field day. So in dealing with an emerging industry, I guess one of the challenges is you're taking that emerging industry and their leadership on a bit of a journey as well in trying to explore what's going to work best for them. So everyone has preconceived ideas, and we can't help that. And some of them are completely valid approaches. But we've got a unique opportunity to try new things as well because we've got an untested market. And so let's push the boundaries and see, go on that journey with those industry leaders and say, well, actually, why don't we do it like, have a go at this approach, see how that works, and be brave to try something new, because that's the fun thing about emerging industries. These are people who are willing to have a go at something completely different. So you've got a little bit of license to operate, which is fun.
Yeah, perfect. So most of the extension work that I do is in the grain sector, which is obviously a commodity-based industry. But what I think was, what I find really interesting about these emerging industries from an extension perspective is not only does the extension need to help the producer in terms of, giving them the R&D that they need to be able to produce the product, but they also need to be able to sell it. So they need to be, so the extension is encompassing not just the production, but also the marketing side of things and that engagement with the consumer, because obviously that's going to be a much closer thing. So how are you going, how do you work in the consumer element and the market element and the production element all together in your extension approaches?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because when we're talking about going on that journey with the industry as well, part of that is capacity building, because that industry is going to grow, is going to need to start thinking about things ongoing, and so that listening, framing discussion taps into not just why should we grow it, because no one's going to grow it if there's no market. So why should someone buy it as well, buy that product? And so we talk through, some of those push button things, and we do some capacity building activities along the way as well. So it's not just giving those foundational tools like the basic slide deck of, okay, if I've got an opportunity to present, I've got something, I know I've got my solid base of messages that I can build from. Okay, that's great. But it's also, well, okay, if I meet someone in the elevator at the farmers markets and they say, oh, tell me about native grains, how are you going to answer that question? Because when you've got really passionate people, the default is to go into mega detail and bore the audience to death. So we've been doing some workshops with some native food producers actually around how to tell a provenance story. So thinking about the audience first. why should they be curious? What is going to, if they're curious about food, what's going to set off their sensory sort of radar? What words can we use to describe native honey, for example? How is that different than any other honey? So we need to use language in a way to help them. So they've been really fun to work with because they're so willing to learn and have a go. And so they've been having a lot of fun trying to articulate a provenance story. And the big challenge for them is, oh, well, I've got so much to say. And they just talk and talk and talk. Okay, well, now you tell me that story in one sentence. And so we've got to go. We have multiple versions of the same story depending on audience. So there's a capacity building thing there where they're learning about audience and adapting message to audience and circumstance and being able to do it succinctly or in detail. But the key thing is, if they want to grow business and grow consumption, curiosity is such a powerful motivator. So can we make the consumer curious about the product? Can we make other farmers curious about growing it? What are the words and levers that we can use to make people curious and excited?
Perfect. And Michael, you have shared with me a resource that you've produced for the project on how to write your provenance story, and you've graciously allowed that to be shared through the webinar. So I am sharing that with everybody right now. You should see the opportunity to download a handout appearing on your screen right now, so you can grab a copy of that resource now. Michael, I'm interested in the role of peer-to-peer. So, for me, grains industry, peer-to-peer is just really, really critical for extension as farmers learn from other farmers. Is that going to be the same in your emerging industries? I know that it'll be different from, across the industries, or, because it's an emerging market, is there a bit more competition and a bit more?
Yeah, you do see a little bit of that where people, they see a unique opportunity and they want to own it all, and so they get a little bit secretive. Some of them do. Others are really collegiate about it and going, well, we're not going to get from A to B on our own. We need to get more people involved. This is such a great story. We want to share it. So, this is the gamut of human nature that we're dealing with. So you see a bit of both. Peer-to-peer is super important. And whether it's, if you think about peer-to-peer in that agents of change sort of dynamic, of maybe it's not just a peer, but who else is in that conversation that the audience might be influenced by. So I think so for example, in industrial hemp, normalizing that as a crop that's going to be mainstream, it's amazing to show mainstream farmers, the people who are growing it, they've got a centre pivot. So they're big, serious farmers. Yeah, they are. Yeah, you should talk over the fence. It changes the dynamic of the conversation. And I think, and there is a fair bit of social science research, behavioural science, showing that farmers of most descriptions have an inherent mistrust of academics and scientists and as the voice of a message. So if a scientist tells you to do something, oh yeah, but what would they really know? They live in an ivory tower with their calculators and helicopter hats. If they hear the same thing from a peer or from someone else that they trust, it changes how they receive that message altogether. So we've got to be a bit smarter about the channels we go through to socialise a message. And I think that's one way of really thinking about it, is socialisation of a comms activity rather than a linear A to B. We're trying to create a conversation that will self-sustain.
Perfect. We've had a question pop in from Felicity, and just so going back a step when you were mentioning capacity building, how are you delivering that capacity building to producers? What activities do you run?
Yeah, so that provenance storytelling workshop is an example of that. So that's a two-part workshop where we do lots of practice and we break down from, okay, walk in the door and tell us your story. What's your product? What are you growing? And we use a peer-to-peer model there. We deliberately have people from other industries in that group. So it's not just, you're not walking in with the baggage of knowing everyone in the room and worried about what they might think of your story. We've got, when we ran it recently with the native foods, we had a native grains producer, we had a marron producer, we had a native honey. So they're peers in a sense, and they're all in the same boat together, all trying to grow their own sector of the own industry. but by receiving feedback from that real-time audience feedback from people in that dynamic, they were very receptive, very participatory, conversational, and watching that evolution of their skill set happen in real time was really fun to do. So we do workshops like that, through to everything from media training through to basic, I guess, presentation skills, comm skills, right? We do a fair gamut of comms in trying to support those, giving them the tools. Ultimately, we want to empower people to be able to tell their own story, enable them to be agents of their own change.
Still no silver bullet, is there?
No, you've got to do a bit of everything, unfortunately.
Michael, I'd just like to focus in on native foods specifically. What's been your process for Indigenous engagement and consideration of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Prue. I think so. Two things. One is, first and foremost, I said earlier, we've got to be good listeners, and I think we need to be especially good listeners in the Indigenous space. And this is something that AgriFutures, I think, really gets and does well, is that they're, I guess, being quite sensitive to the fact that in the past, native food opportunities have been capitalised upon by non-Indigenous Australians. So you think about barramundi or macadamias or whatever, they've been huge commercial successes. I guess what we're trying to do in working with them is enable them to be masters of their own destiny. This is their cultural product, cultural heritage, Indigenous IP, recognising that at the outset. And so in the comms extension space, it's also understanding that with that comes a unique and distinct way of articulating a product story and value and cultural heritage. And so we've got to be sensitive to that and not try and impose, this is how you must market your product, or this is how you must sell your story. Because what makes that product, that native food, unique is that history and that provenance. So it would be ridiculous to try and go down that road. So really being alert to the fact that what makes it special, we need to respect that and allow those stories to be told in their own way.
Wonderful, thank you. Now I want to switch across to the behavioural science side of things, and just a little bit of background is we covered on behavioural science for designing RD&E in a webinar last year with Courtney Ramsey from GRDC, but earlier this year we had some post-evaluation feedback. We always provide the opportunity for you to suggest any future topics you'd like, that said they'd like some more on behavioural science. So I've done a little bit of a Google search, and that's when I came across you and this project, and that that one of the key tenets of what you were embedding through this work was the use of behavioural science as a way of designing your extension activities. So I thought that would be a really nice thing to throw together. And then when I first reached out to you, said, I'm also doing my PhD on this. So it was just this. That's why I love these conversations, because people are already always delivering such awesome work that all ties in together, but might not look that way on paper at first glance.
Yes.
But let's look at that behavioural science side of things. Why is it important for you to consider behavioural science when you're designing your extension programs?
First and foremost, because that's the evidence that the science that has been done, we know that it works. And I think this is a challenge for extension practitioners and comms practitioners is to be proud of that. I know from experience in writing funding proposals or dealing with program managers who often come from a quantitative scientific background. They're managing scientific research projects, and they see the comms and extension as the soft, fluffy stuff over on the side. And we sort of play into that a little bit, and it's like, don't let them in on the trade secrets. But I think we need to be proud of the fact that actually what we do is underpinned by really serious research, behavioural science research, and this is why we know why what we do works. And if we want to try new things and be better at new things, then we have to promote the science that underpins that, or the need for further research in some of these extension activities.
Excellent. And so how do you build this into your program? Do you always use the same principles in every extension program? Do you tailor it?
Yeah, every extension program needs to be tailored to circumstance. There are really common principles that, we use all the time. So, when in talking about the emerging industries, the main one that we've used to date is in focusing on those foundational things like key messaging. It's around framing. So Daniel Kahneman's done a heap of stuff about framing conversation, and how you start that conversation dictates how it evolves from there. So that's why we've spent so much time on working out how we talk about ourselves as an industry, because that will dictate how the audience responds. So we've got framing is a really big part. And then, yeah, depending on circumstance, the peer-to-peer is a really great model for, developing, I guess, a cohort or a community of practice, which works off, bounces off each other. And we've done that in some research projects where we've incorporated the peer-to-peer with the researchers. So it's a participatory research model where the researchers are highly dependent on the feedback they're getting from the participants. So they're incredibly valued. That drives the research, and the participants are then much more likely to adopt because they're in conversations all the time with the researchers, and that in turn feeds onto the over the fence conversations those producers are having, and they're saying, well, actually, mate, you should try this. We had a really good success with that. So we lean into that. I think one of the things that we had in that proposal was around nudge theory, picking and choosing when to use that. And nudges can take all sorts of forms. On one of your earlier webinars, they referred to the little graphic on your electricity bill about how you compare to your neighbours. That gets me every time. It's a little poke in the ribs to do better. Supermarkets use product placement at certain eye levels changes your interaction compared to other brands.
Yeah, they've done that really well for toddlers.
Yes, yeah. You're not even registering what those toddlers are into. Yeah, it's a really cool area of research. And so when I think about nudges in emerging industries, it's like hemp comes to mind, because farmers are pretty inventive, innovative. They like trying things, with the old farm inventor competitions. And so if you put in front of them, a packet of hemp seeds or a bag of hemp seeds, and this is what we're producing, it's just another seed in a sense. You put in front of them bricks, ropes, jeans, beer. Oh, hemp can make, it's a stimulates curiosity because it was unexpected. So those, now they might be, they're beyond farm gate things, but it's a little nudge, little tactile. Well, let me feel that. Well, what does that feel like? Oh, that's different. Oh, okay. They're sorts of ways that we think about using them, and it adds a different dynamic to your stock standard field day then, because it's not just about walking through the paddock. It starts a whole nother layer of conversation, which stimulates word of mouth marketing, because they mightn't go back, that peer-to-peer, when they go home and tell their mates over the fence. They'll have remembered some of the paddock walk stuff around varieties, but the first thing they'll start the conversation will be the novelty aspect of, holy shit, did you know that you could make this out of hemp? And that starts the curiosity, and what sort of variety does that? It's a prompt, a conversation starter. Yeah.
And the other one that you mentioned earlier as well too was agents of change. Happy to touch base on that one a little bit more as a behavioural science principle and examples of use.
Yeah, totally. Look, pretty commonly used in comms and extension programs, some more deliberately than others. I know whenever we used to do comms materials in our target audiences, we have your primaries and your secondaries are the ones you go through to get to them. So, if you're trying to influence a cattle producer, the stock and station agent could be an agent of change, because they're a key voice. The agronomist to the grain grower, they're very influential. But then you think about it creatively. Our team here in CQU, our agri-tech education and extension team, they do a lot with school-aged children. They come do a workshop with GPS collars on cattle and learn all about the tech. Get super excited. They go home to mum and dad. We should really try some of this stuff. This is so cool. it's not necessarily what mum and dad are. I think anyone who's ever had children has been influenced by their children and what they come home with and what they're interested in. So, the 10-cent recyclables, like it changes our behaviour in the household. So how do we've got a bunch of projects at CQU where we're educating children, but the longer game and extension is that those children are also influencing their parents' behaviours too. So it's a double benefit out of really considered, targeted activity.
Perfect. And just to go back to the peer-to-peer, we've got a question from John. Have you created some communities of practice for any of the 6 industries that you're currently working with?
Not a formal community as yet. So these industries, some of them have established associations. They've been around for a while. They have an established community, if you like. I guess what we're trying to do is how do we build awareness of those communities and connect more people into them. The hemp industry is an interesting one. I mean, the national footprint of those field days around the variety trials is bringing people together. They're travelling long distances to get to these field days, and we've seen people drive 5 or 6 hours just to see a hemp crop. So there's a lot of curiosity, and what we've been very deliberate in capturing attendee data, and so that there is follow-up with the program agronomists, and so that we're starting an informal community of practice where that they know they've met a farmer who's doing it, they've met the agronomist, they're starting to receive the newsletters. We haven't formalised it into a daily sort of WhatsApp group or whatever, but it's a snowball effect of this is the first step towards that end goal.
Perfect. I'm just thinking about, we need to take this is real science, and it needs to be treated as such. And, particularly thinking about framing as that it's been so critical for this early stage of the project that you're working on, and that it's usually something that we're not given that time and that scope to do that framing. So what would your advice be to to us practitioners who need to go out and we want to incorporate more of this into our extension programs? We want the time to be able to do it, and we want the funds to be able to do it. How do we do, like, what do we miss out on if we don't have this thinking in our extension programs?
Well, if you don't know who you're talking to, you can never get your message perfect, can you? You're flying blind a little bit. So the framing's super important, and a few points here. One is at an instinctive one-on-one meet for the very first time, humans are really, really rubbish at assessing who they're talking to. So and what their motivators and behavioural types are. So we'll talk about books later, but if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers, classic, like really well researched book, but lots of examples of how bad humans are at assessing the person in front of them. So we need to do it properly. We can't just sort of wing it. And I think this is the challenge to the extension community to really push this message up to the funding agencies. Research generally, the timelines have got shorter, the expectations higher. We're going to, instead of 5-10 year programs of research where we're going to look at things in depth across time, allow for time for cultural change and evolution, it's 2 to 3 years if you're lucky. Push it out, make something happen. Let's see the results, how many people turned up to your events. The metrics are, I think we're just thinking about it the wrong way, and I think we've got to really lean into that science, which says to those program managers, look, you believe in science, you're a scientist yourself. The science says we need to do our framing and our audience, our market research, and we need to think about human dynamics. They don't change like a light bulb. Very rarely do we have these big epiphanies and change our whole life and invest in a new business just on the spur of a moment. It takes time. Cultural change takes time, and we've got to be open to doing longer term extension programs. And a big part of that is that front ending and getting the doing that market research properly. It's, as I said, it's very difficult in an emerging industry where you've got very small groups and you're with limited resources and or community knowledge of them. So you're doing it in an iterative way. But in a perfect world, it'd be wonderful to have a heap of funds to do a whole heap of work on that front ending to really know, get that aspect of it right, because it is really important.
Perfect. I want to move across and finish up now on your PhD topic, which is creative nonfiction storytelling. And storytelling, again, is, like there's strong behavioral science evidence that demonstrates how humans are geared toward and respond to stories. So let's start with what is creative nonfiction storytelling. And I'm going to pop up a poll to ask everybody who's online whether they've heard of it as well too.
Okay.
What is it?
So in a nutshell, it's telling a true story, but using the stylistic sort of things that we'd expect from a novel or a movie. So it's a really creatively told story, but it's a true story. So we see it in our daily lives. So the magazine pages of like the Weekend Australian magazine or the Sydney Morning Herald's Saturday magazine. They're telling feature stories, what we used to call feature stories in journalism. They're true stories, but they're written, beautifully with a lot of description, a lot of colour, the characters, the challenges they're overcoming, the drama of it is a really heavy emphasis. You think about Australian Story as a TV genre. These are human true stories, but they're very powerful because they really tap into the human element of their the journeys that they're on and the challenges that they're overcoming. So they're coherent, stories in their own right, but creatively told.
Perfect. You've provided me a couple of really great handouts here, but you've provided me some examples of comparative, so serious storytelling versus creative nonfiction storytelling, and you've broken nicely down the elements of each. So that's, I will again share that with everyone, so you should be able to download that now.
I should say, be clear that that's a fictional story.
Yes,
it was
yes,
created
very clear across the top. This is made up. Why was it important for you to do your PhD on this? And what are you exploring in your PhD?
Yeah, the reason I got into the PhD, we'd always been challenged I remember going to pitches for comms projects and extension projects, and the question had always been, how do you know this works? How do we know that actually people are going to change their behaviour? Are they going to adopt? And it was one that we always struggled with. And so, but when you look into the research surrounding storytelling, is that there's quite a body of research showing that the brain responds to story in a very different way to how it responds to straight fact and logical argument. So, and because it's connecting with a different part of the brain and it's connecting with emotion and human experience, it triggers motivational responses. So then the question was, well, why aren't we doing more of that in ag extension? And it really struck me as odd, because you look around, the marketing world, TV advertising, Nike Air, Just Do It. That's, it's a one sentence story, but the imagery tells a quest, someone overcoming a challenge and they're off to succeed. Really powerful emotional motivator. Marketing and advertising have been using it forever. Religion uses it. Lots of stories to explain our place in the world, and it changes how humans behave. And I know from experience of writing a creative nonfiction story in an extension program where it got put on the spike because the program manager was a quantitative scientist. Well, we can't, that's far too fluffy. No, gone. So it's somehow found its way out of ag research extension. It's starting to find its way back in again, which is the encouraging bit. So AgriFutures, to its credit, has been at the forefront of this. That handout that came earlier was the latest in a series of support tools around storytelling, which covers that gamut of audience profiling, key messaging, genre, media, those sorts of questions to help people tell their own story. But yeah, when I looked into it, did a literature review a few years ago, medicine, lots of literature around storytelling as a tool. industry, business, ag, I found one really considered paper, which evaluated the effectiveness of storytelling versus, straight fact. So the paper was by Grace and Kaufman, 2013, Patricia Grace out of Virginia Tech University, I think it was. Got a couple of cohorts of university students. Some are art students with no ag background. Some are ag students with very strong attachment, beliefs around what they do and how to do it, and broke it up into groups. Different cohorts received a creative story orally told. Some read it. Another group just received fact sheets, and another group got a lecture. So very different treatments from that scientific point of view. And the groups that shifted, their attitudes towards intensive agricultural farming, farmers shifted their attitudes towards it, as well as the art students. The only ones that really shifted were the ones that received the storytelling version of that set of information. So we know it works. We know it can shift entrenched views as much as influence people with no association with an industry. The fact sheets and the lectures didn't shift attitude. So the reason I'm really curious about this is fact sheets and lectures have a place. People when they want to get information in a fact, that the detail, they'll go looking for those elements. What I'm curious about is willingness to change. So if we want to get farmers in a mindset of being curious and wanting more information, wanting to turn up to the workshop and go and learn or try something different, perhaps that's where we use creative nonfiction storytelling to create a motivated mindset and create curiosity. So that's what we're examining. So interviewing a lot of agricultural comms and extension practitioners at the moment, questioning around awareness, curiosity about whether they think it'd be useful, do they know about it, whereabouts in the extension pipeline would you use it if you did, and we've had all sorts of answers from at the awareness stage right through to the monitoring and evaluation and reporting stage of, okay, this would actually be useful to persuade the funders that we've got to do more of this. So it's the full gamut. So it's really interesting to see how people see opportunity in this space, but that's how I came about.
Perfect. And John's asked for the reference to the study again, please, out of Virginia Tech.
Yep, great. GRACE and Kaufman, KAUFMAN. The paper was in 2013, I think. Yeah.
Perfect. And John, if you can't find that, you can flick me an email, and I'll chase Michael down and get it for you.
Yep, certainly.
Perfect. So that's a really good look at how it looks in practice, where it works, where it might not work, why we're not using it as much in agriculture. Is there friction between creative nonfiction storytelling and the increasing demand for sort of bite-sized digital content, or do the two actually complement one another?
They can totally complement one another. I think when we think of that definition of creative storytelling, we default to novels or movies as long form, but there is a bunch of research showing that you can tell a story in a sentence and still have a stimulated emotional response just through the structure of the sentence and the use of adjectives to make it creative. So radio advertising, you think about 15 to 30 seconds, and some of those ads, they do tell a story and they do motivate purchasing decisions. So it can be done, but yeah, that Mark Twain saying, if I had more time, I would have written less or something like that. Yeah. So
I love that one. If I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so here's a long one or something. I'm paraphrasing, but yes, that and we see that all the time. That ability to be succinct is something that is more likely to get your content engaged with, but it's actually the much harder thing to do. Although I haven't waded into TikTok yet, and I kind of feel like I should, but there seems to be the generation using TikTok have nailed that really short form of content really well. So yeah, we've got to get a
yeah.
We've
got to get our heads around it.
Yep. Perfect. Look, we're at the nearly up to time. I've got the opportunity for anyone who's listening online to pop in any more quick questions if you want to get them through. While we're waiting for any last minute questions to come through, we always finish up with a little bit of a show and tell. Now, Michael, you've already mentioned a number of resources today. Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, Gladwell's Talking with Strangers. Any other books, podcasts? What else is on your list? We appreciate that everybody's not going to be able to know everything from our 1 hour webinar. So where should people go next if they want to learn a bit more about what we've been discussing today?
Yeah, okay. So yes, if you're interested in framing, Kahneman's the great place to start with Thinking Fast and Slow. I do love Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History, great example of creative nonfiction storytelling, because it's history that he's recording, but he's telling a yarn, and it's really colourful and creative and insightful, but some lots of insights into human behaviour we pick up there. If you're keen to have a go at that form of writing, I guess, of story construction, Writing True by Pearl and Schwartz is probably the Bible on improving your writing or developing some of those creative elements to go from beyond just a case study, which is really bare fact, and a series of events into something that's a really powerful narrative. A couple of others that sort of got me on this road years ago. I did a minor in English Lit way back when I was at uni. E.M. Forster's Aspects of a Novel. He has a lovely little passage in there about how fiction can be more revealing of truth than history alone, because it goes beneath the surface of fact. There's a nice passage in there, as well as some good tips. And Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, is a bit of a classic memoir. It's a creative nonfiction. It's a memoir, but it's a really human story, and it really shows how she used story to, I guess, promote change in what was then well, probably still is a very male-dominated area that she was working in.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. I've popped all of those references. I didn't get the one for the paper, sorry, John, but I popped all those references for all of the books and podcasts in the chat there for anybody who is in the audience. So we are out of time. Michael, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot about emerging industries. This is great. And thank you very much to our audience today for joining in. We hope that this has stimulated your thinking. And if you're planning on doing something different as a consequence of today's webinar, we'd love to hear it in the comments. I've popped up the registration for our July webinar on the screen, so you should see a little pop-up there. Our guest is going to be Dr. John James, who is the Director of Enablers of Change. And John is online today. Thank you, John, for some good questions. And John and I are going to be having a conversation about ChatGPT and other forms of AI, and we're going to be looking at how they might change how we do ag extension. Is the tech going to be a massive disruptor or a value add? What skill sets are going to be needed to make the most of it? Is it going to make some skills redundant? Are farmers going to want to use it, and what's the downside? I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's something I've been spending a bit of time thinking about myself of late. Once this webinar finished, you're going to be directed to a survey link. I know nobody likes filling them out, but it would be very much appreciated if you could please take the time. It takes less than a minute, and as you've seen from today's webinar, the topics that you put forward as suggestions for future webinars, I do listen to, and I do try and find really awesome presenters who can deliver on those. So your completion of that survey is really appreciated and helps us plan and evaluate this and other activities. Thank you again for participating in today's Expanded Horizons webinar delivered by the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. For those of you who I'm keeping from a long weekend, please go and enjoy.